Hi everyone, my name is Stephen Zhang, and welcome to my project for this queer life. In this course, we've learned how attacks on queer and trans people have become a central strategy of global neo-fascist movements. But what does this mean for everyday people? How do queer and trans issues show up in local life? For today's project, I decided to focus on one longer interview with someone very close to me. Cecilia and I were actually high school deskmates back in China. Now, she's studying at the University of Chicago, and she has been active in LGBTQ student clubs and events there. She also identifies as a lesbian, and her story shows us how identity and politics can feel very different in the East and the West. So let's hear from her. Cecilia, do you think LGBTQ issues are politically relevant right now?
Yes, very much so. In the US, LGBTQ issues are right at the center of politics. You constantly hear about them in election speeches, in court cases, and in news debates. Politicians, especially conservative ones, use queer and trans people almost like symbols, something they can attack in order to show strength or to claim they are protecting traditional values. For example, there has been huge debate about trans healthcare, bathroom bills, and even whether books about queer life should be allowed in school libraries. These aren't small or isolated issues. They are deliberate strategies to create fear, to distract voters from economic or social problems, and to rally people around an enemy. So, yes, LGBTQ issues are extremely relevant right now, not because politicians actually care about queer lives, but because they see political gain in attacking us. Coming from China, I notice a big contrast. In China, LGBTQ issues are rarely spoken about in politics at all. They're invisible, there are no real debates, no new laws to discuss, just silence. But silence doesn't mean safety. It means your existence isn't recognized, your needs aren't addressed, and you have no real space to claim rights. So I see two extremes. In the US, queer and trans people are hypervisible, but often as targets of backlash. In China, queer and trans people are invisible, which can feel safer on the surface, but it's really just another form of erasure. Both situations show how deeply politics shapes queer life, even though they look very different on the outside.
Have you seen any LGBTQ issues in the news recently? And how do they connect to your daily life?
Yes, absolutely, I see stories about LGBTQ issues in the news almost every week. Recently, I read about states trying to ban pride events, limit drag performances, and even censor entire bookshelves in schools because they include queer characters or queer history. Even something as simple as a rainbow flag outside a shop or on a university building can spark heated arguments online. Those stories really remind me that queer visibility is never neutral, it's always political and always contested. At the University of Chicago, I see both the positive and the negative sides of this reality. On the positive side, I feel freer here than I ever did back in China. I can join queer student groups, go to events openly advertised on campus, and even walk in a pride parade without worrying that I'm breaking the law. I can introduce myself openly as a lesbian, and people treat it as a normal part of who I am. I've met friends who share my experiences, and those connections make me feel affirmed in a way I never had before. But the backlash is also very real. When I read about states criminalizing gender-affirming healthcare, I immediately think of my trans friends about their future access to doctors and whether they'll be forced to move to another state just to survive. Even at school, I sometimes overhear conservative students making dismissive jokes about queerness, and it's a reminder that being visible doesn't always mean being safe. Visibility can be powerful and affirming, but it also paints a target on your back. Back in China, the situation is almost the reverse. Queer life mostly happens underground in private circles, coded conversations, or small online groups. That isolation can be crushing. You don't face open hostility in the news, but you also don't get recognition. Instead, you grow up learning to self-censor, to avoid words or gestures that might reveal too much. So, moving to the US was liberating, but it also introduced a new kind of fear, the fear of being seen and then attacked. That's why the news feels so personal to me. It doesn't just shape politics in general. It shapes how I walk through campus, how I think about safety, and how I imagine my future.
From your perspective, as someone who's lived in both China and US, do you feel things are getting better or worse for LGBTQ people?
That's such a complicated question, because it depends on what you mean by better. On a personal level, my life has definitely improved. Being in the US gave me the chance to come out, to join a queer choir, to attend pride marches, and to find a community that supports me. Those are things I couldn't even imagine back in high school in China, where I felt I had to hide every part of myself. So, in that sense, yes, my life is better, and I'm grateful for that freedom. But at the same time, the backlash is very real. Every step forward seems to trigger a step backward. The more trans people push for healthcare rights, the more politicians try to restrict them. The more pride grows in visibility, the louder the calls to ban it become. It doesn't feel like a straight line of progress. It feels more like a tug of war, with forward movement always pulling against backlash. That can be exhausting, because it reminds you that progress is never secure, it can always be challenged. In China, progress looks very different. It's slower, more private, but still present in small ways. I've seen more young people come out online, more friends quietly supporting each other, and small underground organizations creating safe spaces. But because there is no official recognition or legal protection, all of that progress feels fragile. It could disappear quickly if the state decides to crack down harder. So my honest answer is that things are both better and worse at the same time. They're better in terms of visibility, courage, and community, because more people like me are finding ways to speak openly and support each other. But they're worse in terms of risk, because every gain seems to invite stronger opposition. The future, I think, depends not only on queer people being brave, but also on whether allies, institutions, and governments are willing to stand with us consistently. If support only shows up in June during Pride Month, then progress will remain fragile. But if support becomes steady, embedded, and year-round, then the future can be one of real change instead of endless cycles of progress and pushback.
Thank you, Cecilia, for sharing your thoughts. What I take away from this interview is that queer issues today are both deeply local and deeply global. Locally, in the US, attacks on queer and trans people are an everyday reality. They show up in headlines, in school board debates, and in healthcare policies, and even in what books can be read by children. These attacks are not accidents. They're coordinated strategies designed to make queer and trans people as scapegoats for broader social anxieties. In China, the challenges look very different. There aren't daily headlines about trans healthcare or drag bans. Instead, the challenge is silence, the absence of recognition in politics, in media, even in everyday language. That silence can feel like a form of protection, but it's also a form of erasure. It means that queer people grow up without role models, without legal protection, and often without the confidence to speak their truth. But Cecilia's words show that these two contexts are not separate, they mirror each other. Whether through attack or silence, queer lives are being constrained by systems of power. And both forms of constraint, loud hostility or quiet invisibility, are strategies that limit freedom. What stood out to me most is that queer politics are not just about individual identity, they are about democracy itself. When politicians target queer and trans people, they are really testing how far fear can be used to divide society. These attacks are less about protecting children or defending tradition and more about seeing whether scapegoating can win elections. That is exactly what we've been studying in this course, how global neo-fascist movements weaponize attacks on queer and trans people to build power. At the same time, resistance is everywhere. Cecilia described how joining a student club, attending Pride, or simply saying I am a lesbian in public is an act of courage. These small acts are not small at all. They're political acts, acts of survival, acts of claiming space. They remind us that resilience is not just a slogan, it's something lived in everyday choices. So, where are queer issues right now? They are contested, fragile, but also profoundly resilient. Every attack signals both vulnerability and strength because it means queer lives are visible enough to matter and strong enough to frighten those who want control. That resilience built from community, from memory, from the courage of individuals like Cecilia is what gives us hope for the future. This has been my project for this queer life. Thank you for listening.